come, so I'm substituting in for him. So this session, we have two speakers, Eswar Prasad and Marcel Chauvet. And we'll start with Prasad, please.
It's very exciting to be a macroeconomist these days, but also very challenging. As Chris Sims in his talk pointed out, it's much harder for us macroeconomists to hide behind the veil that we can ignore certain parts of the economy while keeping other parts of the economy as the elements of our focus. In particular, it's become much harder to leave out finance from macro or macro from finance, whichever perspective you approach it from. It's become much harder to leave out the international aspects of much of the work that we do, given how closely financial markets are integrated and how much that seems to matter. But it's also an interesting time because policymakers, the press, everybody wants to hear from economists about what the heck is going on. And there is a presumption, of course, that we academic economists understand things, which is sort of nice, but also a little scary in some ways. And I suspect all of us academic economists have dealt with this issue of having to deal with policymakers who ask us fairly direct and important questions. For instance, if a central bank governor were to ask you, as often is the case with me, about what channels of transmission they should worry about from the advanced economies, in particular if you're an emerging market country. One needs to think a little bit about this, and the temptation is to offer semi-plausible answers which sound good, but which don't have much discipline behind them. And I think the lecture by Professor Sims was especially important in terms of pointing out how crucial it is to think about the advice that one provides in the context of specific models and to try to stay constrained within the parameters of what our models teach us, which is intrinsically very limited. So this was just a very long-winded way of saying that part of my research agenda does try to grapple with some of these issues, and not with the level of sophistication we saw earlier, but trying to deal with this in a way that tries to meld looking at the data in a somewhat disciplined fashion, but without putting too much discipline on it, simply because the theory is not quite there yet. I still think it's very important to interpret results and to use theoretical frameworks to guide one's empirical work. But in some of my work, I think I've tried not to be too constrained by what theory can tell us, simply because theory at the moment, I think, still leaves out some very important issues. So this is joint work with Ayhan Kosei at the IMF and Chris Otrok at the University of Missouri. Now, we've been doing some work on business cycles for a while, and the issue of the international transmission of business cycles is something that's been of interest to me for quite a while. And I think we are beginning to expand the set of questions that we can address in this research program. So what I want to talk about today is a sort of overview of the research agenda. And given the nature of the audience here, I thought it's important to first lay out the research agenda, talk about what we hope to achieve in the ideal world, and then provide at least some flavor of the technical work. And the particular paper that I was hoping to talk about in more detail, the progress has been far more limited than ideal. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the progress we have made in that project. So I'm going to start with an overview of the key elements, talk a little bit about the empirical motivation of putting together the real economy and finance. And again, the very impressive lecture we just heard has essentially done that in a much more sophisticated fashion. But I want to again link some elements of existing theory to the empirical work I want to talk about. Then I'll talk about a very specific issue that I'm trying to come to terms with in this research paper, and then provide some very, very preliminary results. And again, here I'm not going to go through the results in very much detail, but just give you a flavor of what the methodology might be capable of if we can actually get the whole thing implemented. And we are quite a ways away from that. So there are some significant methodological challenges in the whole business cycle literature, and I'll talk about them in more detail, but at a very basic level, especially in the context of crises, one can think about, for instance, the difficulty of distinguishing between common shocks and spillovers of shocks. And the financial crisis, of course, was a very good example of this, trying to think about whether, in fact, what the world was hit with was a common shock around the world, or really a shock that was attributable to the US and that then spread to the rest of the world. And where shocks come from turns out, of course, to be very important in designing policy responses, as does the question of what are the channels through which either common shocks or country-specific shocks are transmitted. And that, of course, is a very difficult problem that ultimately requires one to take a stand on certain issues. So invariably, there is a concern that one's a priori assumptions are driving many of the empirical results. So that is one of the key challenges. And this issue about the interactions between the real economy and the financial sector are, of course, an added layer of complication. I'll talk a little bit about the channels through which financial shocks can have real effects, again, drawing on the work of many others, because that has some implications for the empirical choices made in the model. Plus, going back to the old tradition of thinking about how to measure business cycles, again, there are many people in this room who've made fundamental contributions there. And we want to think about measuring business cycles not just with an indicator like real GDP, but to think about business cycles in a much broader context. And finally, we need to think a little more about the world at large. And given the rising importance of emerging markets, it's hard to think about shocks going in just one direction, from the advanced economies to the emerging markets. Increasingly, what happens in China matters for what happens in many advanced economies, including to some extent the US. So one needs to think about an empirical framework that can handle dealing with much broader groups of countries. So let's start with some of the analytical things that one has to grapple with in this issue. And this is one major methodological challenge I've already talked about, trying to distinguish between country-specific shocks and shocks that are going to hit an economy, all economies, but in different ways and at different times. And also with more trade and financial integration, one needs to think about two types of spillovers, both direct spillovers, say the US economy affecting Brazil, but also in the context of the model, the US economy affecting the world component in some sense, and then through the rest of the world affecting Brazil, or through specific countries. Perhaps the US affects China, although increasingly it's more a question of China affecting the rest of the world. But from the point of this typology, thinking about the US affecting China and then affecting Brazil. So once you start thinking about the ways in which an economy can have shocks transmitted to it from the rest of the world, whether these are shocks emanating from a particular country that feed into it, a global shock, or a shock that is transmitted to a third country, becomes important. And you can immediately see that this is, we have no hope in hell of sorting out all of these channels. So we're going to have to start in a much more modest space. Then one has to think about these financial and real spillovers, because the presumption for many of us working in business cycles was that we could think about the real economy, and the finance part of the economy was sort of in the background. In many macro models, of course, there was a closer integration of the two, but in some of the reduced form work on business cycles, that was essentially set aside. But that's become much harder to ignore, and especially when one thinks about cross-country propagation of shocks or spillovers of shocks, that's something we do need to keep in mind. Now, of course, when one thinks about these spillovers, it's not quite so important for a specific class of questions. So it's sort of crucial to be clear about what questions we are after here. If it's simply a matter of measuring co-movement, then we care a little less about where the co-movement across countries comes from. We just want to understand better how closely business cycles in different economies are connected. But if one wants to think about policy issues, And increasingly, perhaps if one wants to think about the co-movement issues itself, then one does need to think about the spillovers of shocks. Because ultimately, if it turns out that a lot of the channels are through financial markets, then even if countries do the right things with their macro policies, it's not obvious that countries can protect themselves. And again, there are many real-world examples one can point to, with many emerging markets now being in much better macro shape in terms of the standard fundamentals. They have much better public debt to GDP ratios on average than the advanced economies. Many of them have floating or flexible exchange rates and much better monetary policy framework. Many of them have inflation under control. And yet, when the advanced economies do crazy things, that spills over through financial channels, even if the trade channel is less potent. So the set of issues we have to deal with has become much broader, although I think this makes it incumbent on us to define the question somewhat more sharply. So let's start by talking about this one particular complication, which again has been dealt with in some depth already. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the interactions between these two parts of the economy, talk a little bit about the theory and the empirical evidence which guides us towards putting finance into these reduced form models. I'll show you a few correlations, and of course these matter, and I think it's not something I need to persuade you about, that financial market shocks do have significant effects, not just in financial markets themselves, but in the real economy. So I'll just motivate that a little bit based on some work that I and my co-authors have been doing. And there's been some work on this particular set of areas. So there is a tradition of trying to meld together finance and macro. So this is not like it's completely new and we macroeconomists are waking up today and realizing that finance and macro need to be put together. There is a long tradition of looking at financial factors in driving business cycle outcomes. There is some work in the business cycle literature itself trying to think about the nature of financial variables, although there, again, it wasn't so much a matter of tying together finance and real variables, so just seeing them as being parts of the same phenomenon. And then, of course, there are issues about the implications of financial crises for the real economy. And one of my co-authors in particular, Ehan Kose at the IMF, and Marco Terrones, who gave a talk yesterday, have been doing a lot of work in this area. And this is, again, just very basic reduced form stuff showing what the relationship between is financial market variables and real variables. And the notion is that financial markets have become more important, that they are driving real activity. And there is some evidence that this is so, but if you look at very simple and simplistic measures of correlation, say, between house price changes and output growth, it's not obvious that things in the what we call the globalization era, which is the era after the mid-1980s when financial globalization really took off, it's not obvious that those correlations have actually increased within each country. Equity price changes, on the other hand, are much more substantially correlated with real variables. And even there, in emerging markets, there is this curious disconnect between what is happening in the real economy and what is happening in equity markets in particular. So this tension is actually going to permeate some of this work, because it turns out that with more financial integration, financial markets have actually become much more correlated. But it's not obvious that that has led to much more correlation, at least in normal times, between real variables in terms of the way we traditionally think of business cycles. And I'll show you some results related to that shortly. And what seems to be the case is that in many economies, the financial markets and the real economy are getting somewhat disentangled. And again, the US is one good example of this right now. The US economy is not doing too well. US equity markets are doing very well, of course, perhaps thanks to Uncle Ben. If you think about China, the equity markets have been doing terribly. The economy is not doing quite so badly. So this becomes an issue as well, not just thinking about financial spillovers, which seem to be getting stronger, but whether in fact they have been having a greater effect on the variables we care about. So if you look at these cross-country correlations, there is a slightly different picture. If you look at the correlations, this is cross-country correlations of output growth. And again, this is very basic stuff. There's nothing the slightest bit sophisticated here. Looking at the difference in correlations of output growth across countries, and this is the average correlation across a bunch of advanced and emerging market economies. That correlation has gone up in this globalization period, and the difference is statistically significant, which is what those asterisks are telling you. House price correlations have gone up around the world, and here we're getting into slightly more murky territory, why house prices should be correlated across countries. Equity prices have become much more correlated, and credit growth has become somewhat more correlated. So it looks like the world is sort of moving together a little more. And it turns out that, of course, including the period up to and right after the financial crisis is sort of important for this result, but not crucial. If you look at what the evidence is, and again, this is nothing new. There is work by many people that has looked at this. If you look at very large financial market disruptions in the form of credit crunches, a house price bust, which are defined as very significant dislocations in these markets. So if you try to order changes in prices in these markets and look at the bottom quartile of changes in these variables and try to see if recessions associated with such large declines in, say, credit growth or house prices are associated with bigger recessions, it turns out they are. It turns out we get much deeper recessions and also much more protracted recessions. So it's going to be something that we have to deal with, this issue of spillovers. But the additional issue here is that given that you have much greater cross-country correlation, and again, right now we're just talking about correlations. We don't have any statements about whether this really matters in a causal sense, or these are just being, these are just the reflections of common shocks. So as I mentioned to you, we need to think about these first and second round spillovers. And one wants to have a framework in which one can jointly analyze the advanced economies and emerging markets. And I've already hinted at this issue that the financial market spillovers seem to be greater. So these are all plausible statements again, but one needs to look at them. One needs to look at the data, which is what we plan to do here. And emerging markets really can't be ignored anymore. If you look at the evolution of the GDP of different groups, and again, this is not something I need to work hard to make a case about. The emerging markets have had much better growth performance, and in fact, in the last 3 or 4 years after the financial crisis, emerging markets have accounted for more than half of world GDP growth, whether you measure it at market exchange rates or PPP exchange rates. Now, that leaves us at a situation where we have to think hard about measuring what we need to measure. So the first issue is, what do we think about as capturing the business cycle? And here again, there are lots of ways of thinking about it. The more data you have, the more sophisticated we can be about this. One way of thinking about this in the old literature was just to think about GDP growth, but even the NBR going back did use multiple indicators for thinking about business cycles in the US, and then Stock and Watson and many others, including many in this room, have made contributions in terms of measuring business cycles. But I think it's hard to think about business cycles as just being represented by one variable. But this creates complications when you start looking at multiple countries, especially emerging markets. I think many of us would love to do what Stock and Watson have done for a bunch of countries, but it ain't realistic. But one does want to work with broader measures of business cycles. So what we do in this work is basically use 3 key macro aggregates: output, consumption, and investment. And I can tell you that getting good quarterly level data, quarterly frequency data for a bunch of emerging markets, even the big ones, is a huge challenge in itself. On financial variables, again, based on some of the results I've showed you and a lot of other work being done, we're going to think about 4 variables in our framework: equity and house prices, a policy variable, which is the short-term interest rate, and credit growth. In some emerging market economies, credit growth ends up being the policy variable, actually. Now, one of the approaches to measuring cross-country spillovers, of course, is using some sort of VR approach, and that does give you some traction, especially in the kind of world where one would like to think about US shocks, for instance, spilling over into the rest of the world. And there are multiple indicator approaches that try to take that to a slightly greater level of sophistication. But of course, the problem is that the US is a big economy, but it ain't as big as it used to be, and relative to the rest of the world. And if it's not entirely clear if one should think about business cycles around the world being driven just by the US spilling over into the rest of the world, or if it's really truly world shocks that are accounted for. And as I pointed out, one needs a framework where one can think more formally about second round spillovers, and one would like to get a handle on this issue about common shocks versus spillovers. Again, I want to emphasize that if the objective is to measure co-movement, this doesn't matter. And in some of my own work, I have ignored this, because what I really wanted to get a sense of was the degree of co-movement in macro variables across countries. But once you want to start thinking about policy issues, once you want to start thinking about designing mechanisms that buffer you from external shocks, you do need to know about where the shocks are coming from. So again, here there is a long tradition in terms of thinking about dynamic factor models, and Chris Simpson, among others, have contributed a great deal to this. And these basic factor models do, in fact, have a theoretical counterpart to them. They're not always derived from theory, at least some of these factor models, but it turns out that you can have DSG models that give you representations as dynamic factor models. So at least they're not divorced from that theoretical approach. So one sort of approach one can take if you want to measure co-movement is something that many people, including myself, have done, which is to basically think about a factor model where you try to pick up a global factor and different types of factors. So in some of my work, I've looked at region-specific factors versus country factors. Now here again, one is making the assumption that these factors are mutually orthogonal, but if you really care just about measuring co-movement, it doesn't matter that much. Now, in some of the work I did, I was trying to get at a very specific question earlier, which was, there was this big debate about decoupling versus convergence. And the issue there is whether, in fact, the emerging markets as a group have sort of de-linked, at least in a business cycle sense, from the advanced economies, even though their financial markets are becoming more integrated. And it turns out that there is some evidence that this is in fact happening. So if you look at the contribution of, in this framework, the world factor to output and consumption growth. So this is essentially taking a group of advanced and emerging market economies, looking at variance decompositions from the factor model and trying to see how much of the variance in the main macro aggregates, output, consumption, investment, which is what enters the model, is explained by this common world factor as opposed to regional factors. And when we were looking at the regional factors, we did look at geographic regions. It turned out that geographic regions don't matter as much as a split between advanced economies and emerging markets. So the regions here really refer to the advanced economy group on the one hand and the emerging market group on the other hand. And the curious thing was that if you look at the contribution of the world factor, it actually went down in this period of what we call globalization. And this seemed sort of counterintuitive because after all, with closer trade and financial linkages, what you expect to see is business cycles moving together much more closely across the globe. So one economy gets hit with an adverse shock through both the trade channel and the financial channel, it should spill over into the business cycle of the other economy. Turns out that that doesn't seem to be happening here. But the interesting thing is that if you look at the contribution of the regional factor, and of course it's a contribution of the regional factor to output growth of countries in that region. There we found that the contribution of these regional factors actually went up. So in other words, the interpretation that we had is that if you look at the real economies, the advanced economies are sort of becoming more closely linked in terms of their business cycles. The emerging markets are becoming more closely linked in terms of their own business cycles, while there is a bit of a dissociation between these two. Now, of course, all bets are off on this when you have a massive shock, although it turns out that even if you include the latest massive shock, these results hold up. In fact, they become somewhat stronger. These results are based on data that go through 2010, because what happened when the financial crisis hit, of course, it looked like everybody was going down the tubes. But what happened in reality, of course, in 2009 and 10 is that the advanced economies continued doing very poorly while the emerging markets recovered very, very quickly. So in fact, from a business cycle perspective, even though this notion that the emerging markets is sort of decoupled seemed to have gone out the window, in fact, if you start looking at the data in the sober light of day, it does look like the business cycles did remain dissociated from each other. And if you put the two together, the global factors and the regional factors, and look at the overall contribution to the macro variables, it turns out there wasn't much of a change. These changes turn out not to be statistically significant. So in fact, it's not that closer financial integration and trade integration has removed common elements, but it's moved the common elements away from the world level to the advanced economy level and the emerging market level. And in this prior work, we actually went through some of the reasons why this might be so. If you look at trade patterns, for instance, for the emerging markets, their big export markets used to be in the advanced economies. And advanced economies are still important, but the amount of trade amongst emerging markets accounted for, the share of emerging markets trade accounted for by intra-emerging markets trade is close to 60% right now. So emerging markets are not relying that much on advanced economy final markets anymore. So we don't have a good handle yet on why this might be so, but at least we have some plausible story. So with this as the background, what do we try to do in this work that I'm going to tell you a little bit about today? So what we're trying to do is extend this framework in a way that we can not just talk about co-movement, but actually try to understand the channels for these spillovers. So we're going to try to separate the components. At the same time, we are measuring the size of the spillovers, and what we hope this method will deliver, and it seems to be sort of working. Anytime somebody tells you seems to be sort of working, you're a little worried, but at least we are on track. So we are hoping to distinguish between common global shocks and spillovers. And the nice thing about the factor methodology that I'm going to talk about now is that it can handle a very large data set, because I've already made a case for why you want to have multiple indicators of business cycles, and a case for why you want to have multiple countries in there, a fairly large set of countries. At a minimum, you want to think about, say, something in the range of 25 to 30 advanced economies, 25 to 30 emerging markets, which together account for about 90 to 95% of GDP growth. Not that the rest of the world isn't important, but this is where the bulk of world GDP is produced. And that sort of economies you need to handle, and the multiple indicators, trying to look not just at one variable but multiple real and financial variables, is important to give us a handle on both real and financial cycles. So again, it's a fairly simple factor structure, and many of you have encountered this before, but there are going to be at least a couple of innovations. So capital gamma T is just going to be an n-dimensional vector of idiosyncratic shock, where each element is going to be allowed to follow an independent AR process of order Q. Psi L, I always used to have trouble with psi, and Marty Eichenbaum at a seminar he gave at Chicago when I was a graduate student stumbled on that, and I said, let's just call it pitchfork, and ever since I've been following his lead and calling it the pitchfork anytime I forget, but for now I remember because I wrote this down. So psi is a block diagonal lag polynomial matrix. Omega is a covariance matrix that is restricted to be diagonal. And what's important here are the latent factors F. And you'll see that that has a particular structure as well that allows us to capture dynamics in the model. So capital F is a matrix that includes the latent factors as well in the contemporaneous values as well as lags. So the lags of the factor enter into this state equation 3. Phi of L is essentially a matrix lag polynomial that governs the evolution of these factors, and how we specify that has some implications for what sort of spillovers we're going to allow in the model, because that shows you the way in which we restrict how certain factors are allowed to affect other factors. And our basic restriction is that it's going to be block diagonal, and beta, of course, is the matrix of factor loadings that you multiply the factor matrix with. So in the simple exercise that we're going to start with, essentially we're going to think about this as a block diagonal matrix, and how we restrict factor evolution is going to allow us to capture and measure spillovers. So you have to make some trade-offs in life. So we're going to use a structure that is fairly flexible, but it's not entirely flexible in terms of allowing any types of spillovers. We do have to put some kinds of restrictions that we're going to do based on plausibility. So the notion that the US is going to affect the rest of the world is one specific thing that we look at. And it turns out in the context of the financial crisis and so forth, trying to distinguish between US shocks, that is US shocks that then spill over into the rest of the world, rather than common shocks is of some interest. So that's the sort of exercise we can do. So if you think about the standard sort of approach, typically phi L is block diagonal, and the exercise that I'm going to talk about here as an illustration is basically going to, I didn't write this down, essentially going to focus on just the G7 economies, so I don't have to show you a massive matrix, and that's the illustrative exercise I'm going to have here. So essentially you're going to have a model where you're going to try to identify one common factor around the world and 7 country-specific factors. So those are going to be the off-diagonal elements that we are going to look at. And I should point out also that one can think about this as a sort of state space equation where equations 1 and 2 give you the measurement equation, and equation 3 is the space transition equation, although that is something that we're not going to emphasize here. So we're going to just think about it as standard macro model. So like I said, we're going to impose 0 restrictions on certain factor loadings to identify the world and country factors. So one example that we can use is where we allow the US to affect the world factors. So the exercise here is to think about whether you can have a US-specific shocks that spills over into the rest of the world, and in the next round affects the rest of the world, possibly including the US itself. So this is going to be an example of where we can stretch the model to allowing country-specific shocks to affect the global common cycle. Now, of course, we're not allowing any country to affect the global common cycle, because that would make the model essentially intractable. But if you believe that certain countries can have shocks that have global implications, and the US is a prime candidate here, we could look at China as well, that gives you a way of doing it. Another model could be one where you have the country factors directly spilling over into other country factors. So essentially here you have asymmetric spillovers across countries, and one can restrict particular types of countries or pairs of countries to have spillovers. And again, the off-diagonal elements of the matrix are where the action is going to come from. Or you can have a fuller decomposition where you set the relevant off-diagonal elements not to be 0, so that you have a full decomposition of these 2 types of spillovers, where you have an effect from the US to the world factor and then to a country, versus from the US to a country. So these are technical details about the estimation and given the lateness of the hour, I'm not inclined to go through this. If there are any questions about the technical methodology, I'm happy to go through this. It's fairly straightforward. I should point out that the priors that we impose here are fairly diffuse, except for imposing stationarity. And this stuff is the analog to the state space setup is fairly standard. We're going to experiment here with using 2 and 3 lags in the autoregressive structure. We're using quarterly data here, so 3 lags seems reasonable, but it gets somewhat harder to deal with this model. And when we did some tests with these smaller structures, it turned out that we didn't really need to go much beyond 3 lags in order to get the sort of dynamics we were interested in. So the estimates of the factors themselves are going to be actually quite similar as in a model with spillovers, but the important thing is that we're going to decompose these factors and their contributions to the variance of the variables we're interested in a reasonable way. And my co-author Chris Otrok, who's a much better econometrician than I am, assures me that this point is true. That in fact the estimation of the factors is going to be robust to minor misspecifications, and in the paper that we're working on we'll have much more details about a justification for this. Now what we're interested in looking at, of course, is the variance decompositions, and here we have to think a little bit about how we set up these variance decompositions, because the simple factor model has this nice property that the factors are orthogonal. So you can basically decompose you can do the variance decompositions quite easily, because the variance decompositions must add up to the total variance of the series. So showing how much of the variance is attributable to a given factor is relatively straightforward. We don't have that luxury here because we are allowing for a much more flexible factor structure. But as the horizon gets large, we get closer to the unconditional variance decomposition. So we're going to rely on that factor to get to this. So essentially, with the benchmark cases would be completely straightforward. So we're going to start with the one step ahead forecast of the factors and the idiosyncratic component. And then the forecast of the observable variable basically allows you to have the forecast error decomposed into the component attributable to the innovations to the global factor, which is this part, and the country factor, as well as the innovations to the idiosyncratic component. So the contribution of the global factor to the one step ahead forecast error of the first observable variable, which is what you're looking at here, what you do is basically divide the forecast error contributions, say, of the world factor, if that's what you're interested in, divided by the forecast error for the observable time series. And as you extend the horizons, this thing begins to settle down and gets you closer. At a very long horizon, in a theoretical sense, it gets you to the unconditional variance decomposition, but it turns out it settles down fairly quickly at a horizon of about 20 to 25 quarters. And you can do the same calculations for the contribution of the country factor and so on. So how does this differ from a lot of similar attempts to do this? So again, without pushing too hard on this term, one can think about this as a sort of general equilibrium approach. And again, I don't want to over-characterize what we're doing. But if you think about what we might think of as a partial equilibrium approach, you basically take US output as given and see how the shocks are transmitted to the rest of the world, or how a financial variable may have a shock that is then transmitted to the real economy. We're going to allow for much more flexible feedback from the country to the world, from the financial to the real sector. Again, not in a completely unstructured way, because that would be hard to implement, but we are able with this framework to parse out the individual components to isolate both the country and world cycles in these two sets of variables that we care about, the real and financial variables. So what we're getting at is really a measure of what is common across a very large data set. And the world factor, we've done some estimations with a much larger data set. And as you can imagine, it's not a huge world factor. This does not mean that there isn't some commonality around the world. But it turns out that given the demands we impose on the data, looking across a very broad group of quite disparate countries and a very large group of variables, we don't get a huge world factor. The other issue here is the US factor is not just capturing US data, but essentially we're taking away what one might think about as the global component. So this is all very good, and much of it at this stage remains an aspiration because we have a bunch of results, but didn't feel confident enough to present them before this distinguished audience because I think we need some refinements. I'm just going to give you a couple of very simple illustrative results just to show you that the methodology seems to be working reasonably well. So as I said, the first exercise is one where we measure spillovers in the real economy. And in this case, we're going to use data on just the real variables. And the point of this exercise is basically to see if the method works in one very specific context. Because the US, one used to think of as basically being the world. So US business cycles were seen as essentially being synonymous with world business cycles. So the question is whether the methodology can tell apart US specific cycles or shocks versus world cycles, and also think a little bit about the channels of spillovers. And the second, we're going to keep the financial sector by itself and try to see what happens if we measure financial cycles by themselves and examine if there is a common financial cycle using these four financial sector variables that I talked about. And then this is the model that I unfortunately last night the results didn't quite work out, and with the late dinner I wasn't able to get the slide together. So this is what we plan to do next, which is basically put these two things together, which is really what we're after, trying to mix real and finance. So what we'll be attempting to do there is essentially look at one world measure of the real cycle and the financial cycle, and look at country-specific factors, again, split into real and financial parts. And the idea here is that we'd be able to allow interaction between these two cycles. So the first illustrative exercise is, like I said, based on just the G7 countries. We're just going to look at the real variables only. We do find a pretty important common cycle. But the interesting thing is that these spillovers do seem to be small during normal times, but much larger, as one might expect, during the global recession. So this shows you the variance decomposition. So what we've done is basically look at each country's output growth and see how much of the variance in that country's output growth can be explained by either the world factor or spillovers from the US factor. And then we average across the country. So what you're seeing here is the average contribution of the world factor during the period 1972 to 89 to output growth fluctuations in the G7 economies. And the number is not insignificant, it's quite large, but the US spillovers by themselves don't seem to be huge. It's largely the world factors that matter. But as you go to the most recent period, so what we do is basically re-estimate the model here over these different periods. And you can, actually this is mislabeled here, it should be 1997 to 2010. So if you look at the last decade or so, it turns out that there is the ability in the model to distinguish between shocks that are starting in the US and shocks that are world shocks. Now, there is one issue here that is a little tricky, because a lot of the literature on global imbalances and so forth has argued that trouble began in the US, but the trouble that began in the US was really the consequence of policies taken in the rest of the world. We can't tell that apart because there is no easy statistical way to talk about policy variables or policy shocks in other worlds, in other countries that then spill over into real and financial markets in the US and then spill over back. But at least in terms of distinguishing between what we know to have been the case, that things got very rough in the US before they got rough in the rest of the world, it turns out you can make a pretty clear distinction between these two sets of variables. So if you look at the contribution, I've just taken the previous picture and distributed the variance shares between the world factor and the US spillover, and this is mislabeled here as well. So it's clear that the US factor has become much more important. So if you can separate out spillovers from the US factor versus the world factor, there is some traction in this model to being able to tell the two apart. And here I didn't put up any specific results, but when we look at these results, basically what we find is that the common G7 cycle is actually just for the stock market, which to some extent surprised us until we started thinking a little more about the results. Because if you look at individual variables, so if you look at a model that uses just housing prices or global credit, it turns out there is in fact a common cycle across countries in house prices. There is in fact a common cycle across countries in global credit. But if you put in the equity market variable, that variable is what has been co-moving most closely across countries. And the common cycle, once you throw all these variables in, is really only for the stock market. So if you go back to a more simple approach of thinking about a simplistic factor model, it suggests that the stock market cycle is really the largest financial component. So at least so far, the methodology is passing the duck test. It does look reasonable if you look at what the implications are for financial market cycles and for real cycles. I'm just going to conclude by talking about what we hope to do with this methodology, which is basically combine the real and financial variables, use a much larger set of countries. The illustrative results I showed you are just for the G7. And we need to think a little harder about what variables best capture these financial cycles. So one way of re-asking the question I asked earlier, what is the relevant channel of transmission of financial shocks? This will enable us to get at least a part of the handle on this by trying to think about where the common shocks are. And we need to work a little harder to characterize the direction of real and financial spillovers and think more closely about the connection with theory. So that's where we are as of now.
I understood that your identification was in this big matrix you had and the spillovers from one country or region to the others. So it would be interesting to see how, if you differ identification strategies, how much your results would change. So I would be curious about this because that's a very sensitive, way of identifying shocks.
Yeah, no, the question here is more about, so the identification strategy itself is less the major concern than just trying to think about what the method tells us, because the block diagonal big matrix basically gives us a benchmark of reference. It's one that captures a commonality without allowing for any types of spillover. So that's a standard benchmark, although we have a lot more stuff that goes into this model. So trying to think about the deviations from that benchmark essentially is what is going to give us traction in terms of trying to find out spillovers. And you're absolutely right. We need to think about in some disciplined way about what sort of spillovers we should be looking at and try to see if there is traction or not. And here again, we don't have a great deal of guidance from theory. We have some degree of guidance from theory about how real and financial markets interact between, within a country. Once one takes this to a multi-country environment, that becomes somewhat harder. And the issue here again is that we don't want to be too constrained by theory, because perhaps the methodology will show us that certain channels of spillovers are really important, and we haven't spent too much time dealing with that in a theoretical context.